Okay. Okay. So there are so many insightful conversations and incredible stories we've shared on this show. And this one was yet another example of a conversation where I went in thinking one thing and came out thinking another. Because we're going to be talking with an incredible advocate about ableism and disabilities. A label that, if we're not already impacted by it, it's a label that, statistically speaking, we may all one day live long enough to be impacted by. So we all want to be paying attention.
And maybe, just maybe, if you learn through this episode that the way you thought about ability and disability is different than what you previously assumed, maybe you'll also be open to learning more about race and racism, age and ageism, sex and sexism, anti-LGBTQIA plus sentiment, and so much more. All of these systems of oppression are linked. And I'm so glad that we were able to be in community with someone that I personally know is such a powerful woman in this space for this discussion.
Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic co-hosts and best friends, Sarah and Misasha.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany Yu. I'm the author of the book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a Disability-Inclusive World. And I also run a nonprofit called Disabilities. The best way to think of us is we're kind of like a disability employee resource group that exists outside of a company. And I come into this space based on my own personal experiences. When I was 9, I was involved in a car accident. My dad was driving. He unfortunately passed away. And I acquired a handful of injuries, including breaking a couple bones in one of my legs that would leave me as a temporary wheelchair user for about 4 months. Broken bones heal, but then I also had a severe nerve injury, a type of paralysis in my right arm, known as a brachial plexus injury. Nerve injuries don't heal as much, especially paralysis. And that was 27 years ago.
So thank you for sharing all of that and contextualizing why you are the perfect person to be having this conversation with today. You know, your book has, as incredible books do, done the work to shift my perspective on disability. And given that in the US, as your book tells us, 61 million Americans. This blew my mind. It was 1 in 4 adults have a disability, which makes it the largest minority group in the world. And so I'm really grateful that I'm doing the learning, because it turns out that I absolutely have had and still do have ableist mindsets that I'm now actively working to identify and uproot and change, things I didn't even think about were coming from this sort of closed mindset. So I love that you were able to help me realize this through your book without making me feel bad about it. Like, your book left me feeling really motivated and capable of doing better. And so I'm personally very, very excited to be diving into this conversation with you.
That really means a lot, because I wanted to make sure that learning this work shouldn't be about shame.
Reflecting back on my experience reading the book, I feel like one of the root, like the foundational points that we need to start with is this understanding that, like, it's a misbelief that society has that disability is bad. Can we talk about this a bit, about your definition of disability, how you prefer to talk about it?
Oh, and before you answer that, just to make this even more complicated, can you also talk a little bit about your me, we, us framework that goes through the book? Because that really resonated with both of us, as we're big believers in that too.
Yeah, so let me start with the me, we, us, which is, I structured this book in this framework called Me, We, Us. And this is a framework that I got introduced to when I started entrenching myself in more social impact, social justice spaces. And essentially, no matter who you are and where you are in your disability journey, you will be somewhere along that continuum. So maybe you're starting with the me. What's the language or the things that I need to unlearn? Maybe I did think disability was this bad thing. To then us, which is, okay, if we experience microaggressions in the real world, how do we combat them? How do we interrupt them? To what are the more systemic things that need to be addressed? I do find that sometimes a lot of conversations I do have are stuck in the me, which is important, but I don't want to forget about the larger systemic changes that need to happen as well. So to come back to this idea around disability, so part of why I wanted to start sharing about the Me, We, Us framework is, I will say I feel a little bit of frustration that in 2024, I'm still telling people it's okay to say the word disability. I would love to be talking about how we can create policies in our companies to increase disability hiring, or even just helping disabled people get interviews in the first place. But this is where it starts, which is it has been so ingrained that disability is this bad thing. It is reflected in, the book is coming out in October, which is not only National Disability Employment Awareness Month, but it's also Halloween. And a lot of people will have costumes where that incorporate a type of disability as something that's scary or evil or the villain, and that further perpetuates, oh, if I'm a kid and I'm seeing, I don't know, Captain Hook, I'm going to think that, oh, if you don't have a hand, you're Captain Hook and you're the villain, So all of these narratives are starting so early on. The definition that I use of disability is a health condition of the body and or mind that impacts someone in their daily life. There's a more expanded version of this from the World Health Organization, where they describe disability as this interaction of the health condition with personal and environmental factors such as negative attitudes around disability and physical infrastructure inaccessibility. And I kind of like that they mention that inaccessibility, because part of what makes a disability experience so debilitating is that we have to navigate in a world that people stare at us, or they make comments about our disabilities, or just environments aren't accessible for us in the first place. So I think, again, if the starting point is kind of unlearning this association with disability as something bad to, oh, disability is this human experience that 1 in 4 adult Americans experiences, that's a lot of people. I don't want to think that 25% of Americans are bad. Maybe they are for other reasons, but not because of their disability status, right?
There are so many things that I think that you said that are so impactful and so important, especially as we think about how we perceive disability and that negative tie to disability that so many of us may have had through things like Halloween costumes, which maybe people don't think about and associate in the same way. But hopefully now that they've heard you say this, they will think about that in a different way.
Now you can't unsee it.
You cannot unsee it. And I want to shift a little bit because I think people, and the work Sarah and I do too, they want a checklist, right? And if I do these, 12 things, I will not be racist, right? And if I do these 12 things, I will not be ableist in this context. And while I think we can all agree there is no checklist, sadly, to go through, there are some practical ways that we can really think about this in our daily lives, besides maybe not buying that Captain Hook costume and using that, right? Because the language, right, is really important. And I would love to get clear on what words are preferred and not preferred when we talk about disability, as ableist language can be everywhere. And if we don't stop to think about what words we use, we'll continue to perpetuate this, right? Because it's exactly what first comes to mind. So how about we do, because you do this so well in your book, if we could do a quick say this, not that session where Sarah and I can provide the what not to say, and you, Tiffany, can provide what we should be saying instead. Does that sound okay?
Yes. And what I want to highlight, I guess I'll introduce 2 questions you can ask. These phrases are coming out, which are, number 1, what am I really trying to say? And then number 2, what alternative language can I use instead?
I'm going to start on page 21, actually, because you have a couple of pages of charts in there. One is, and I think this speaks to the question I had first asked about our preconceived notions about disability being bad. A lot of times people say they're suffering from disability. What should they say instead?
They're living with their disability.
So they accomplish this despite their disability.
They accomplish this with their disability or while living with their disability.
Handicapped parking.
Accessible parking or disability parking.
Wheelchair bound.
Wheelchair user.
Lost their battle with cancer or depression.
Died. That's one I learned. Someone called me in on that one because I think we frame these diagnoses, cancer and depression, as something we're fighting or we're battling, but no one loses. Or, it's like everyone, I don't know, it doesn't feel like a competition when you
right?
have.
And we all die. We all die. We died of this cause or something that led to our bodies not being able to stay in this world. But it is that idea of a battle and then they lost versus this happens to all of us and we die in different ways. So I like that one too. All right. Next page.
Okay. Paralyzed by fear.
Terrified.
Blind leading the blind.
You can use directionless or clueless or going in circles,
Falling on deaf ears.
talking to a wall,
Tone deaf.
oblivious, ignorant, out of touch,
Blind spot.
a gap in knowledge, bias,
Analysis paralysis.
a state of inaction.
I hope all lawyers paid attention to that one because I feel like I have heard that many, many times. And it turns out there's a better way to say that. That's a real handicap.
That's a real challenge. And I will say, from the version that you have, I actually found I was using some ableist language in my alternatives.
We're constantly learning, right?
Yeah.
And there's a few more things that I have learned through the years not to say too, which you've included, like, that's so lame. Are you deaf? He's a vegetable. She's crazy or insane or psycho, or you're retarded or stupid. And from personal experience too, don't throw stuff like, oh, this is just a touch of OCD, or, oh, I'm so idiot. Like, don't use people's conditions in a casual way to describe a set of behaviors that are actual, like, diagnoses that people live with.
Yeah. Because what ends up happening, I do want to add this color, is that when we use these terms so casually like that, it makes it so that the people who could actually benefit from support don't seek it out because it's so stigmatized.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that session with us of here's what not to say. I appreciate that because, and I'm going to get a little personal here, but personally, I'm the parent of neurodivergent kids who also have mental health challenges. One has autonomic nervous system dysfunction. And so I want to go like expand this conversation a little bit because you mentioned at the beginning, at one point you were a wheelchair user. And in your book, you talk about some other things you live with as a result of the accident. These all fall into this idea, and what my kids are grappling with is about non-apparent disability. And I don't think until your book I would have considered the way that my kids are wired to be something that was a disability. And so I'm deconstructing what that disability is looking like. And I think that's why that first take of disability is bad was most important to me, because at first my gut feel was like, well, like, my kids are wonderful. They're capable. They're not that bad. They're not suffering that much. And then I realized, whoa, this is my bias. This is what I'm saying. Like, they do have needs and support needs, and the world is not made for them. And then I also didn't want to feel like my kids, by calling them disabled, they were taking this disability label away from visibly disabled folks, or that I was saying that they were in some way not capable or less worthy. So it's cringy to admit that I had this whole internal thing of like, wow, does this mean my kids have disabilities? And that it came from this idea that disability was bad. And Misasha, you and I had some good talks about this over the last few weeks as we were discussing this. Your definition of what disability is, what you said earlier, that someone has a health condition or of the body or mind that impacts how they participate in daily activities. By that token, yes, absolutely. This is a disability.
The backstory to why I was having these conversations with Sarah is that I've had multiple spinal fusions. So I have a frozen thoracic spine, basically, and have dealt with that since the last surgery at age 20. And so I don't always take a lot of my mom's advice, but when I had the first surgery, she told me a number of things, but I think that it was more that the surgery was not going to define me. Like, how I chose to view this was going to be what defined that path forward. And she wasn't going to be treating me differently solely because of this, and how we were going to move forward and how I was going to move forward was going to be like the most important thing. And so I think that there was a lot of that strength that she gave me in that moment when I was, a teenager, also just like full of teenage feelings about all of this, that helped me think about how I have this and move this through my life. And so that was what, Sarah and I were talking about in that instance.
Yeah, it was kind of like this. We can use these words and labels to describe what we're going through, but we don't have to place the emotional weight and use it as an excuse or do whatever. It just is what it is. And so I guess this is this tension and the grappling with it that I was doing. Like, can we talk a little bit about the wording we use around non-apparent disabilities? I used to call it an invisible disability or a dynamic disability until I really appreciated the non-apparent disability wording. And what are the things that more people need to know about non-apparent disabilities?
Yeah, such a great conversation, I think, of you two reflecting. And I think part of me identifying as disability and looking at your neurodivergent kids and seeing them as disabilities is that we are part of this really amazing community of people who are trying to navigate a world that wasn't built for us, right? And one of the things I do think about before I talk about non-apparent disabilities is that my dominant arm became paralyzed in this car accident when I was 9. For maybe a couple months afterward, I got extra time on tests. And then when the new school year started, I didn't. And much later now, I went to a camp of people who have my injury called a brachial plexus injury. And they told me that I could have been eligible for something called an IEP, which is an individualized education plan if you have certain types of disabilities. Because here I am taking tests, and maybe this is the daughter of Asian immigrants in me, taking tests with my non-dominant hand and writing essays with the hand I didn't learn how to write with, right? And I kind of look back at that period. I got through it, but it didn't have to be so hard, right? If I and my family acknowledged like, hey, Tiffany is now writing with the hand she didn't learn how to write with. Let's like get her some support because it might take her longer to take the test or write this whole essay, right? And so I come back to this idea, even with non-apparent disabilities, that by identifying them as such, it means that we have the opportunity to get the support that we need or to advocate for the things that we need. So I have friends with ADHD who need lights flashing at a certain period of time to remind them to eat because they get so focused on their work or they lose track of time. Those are the things that they need, right? And so one thing I love, first I'll just talk about non-apparent disabilities. I prefer the term non-apparent disabilities. You might hear others use the phrase invisible disabilities or hidden disabilities. Those all refer to the same thing, but part of why I use non-apparent disabilities is because when we label them as hidden disabilities, there might be this undertone that someone is hiding something. And when we label something as invisible disability, those invisible disabilities can become apparent at any time, but also we don't want to make part of our community feel more invisible than they might already feel. And I actually love it when my friends who have non-apparent disabilities talk about their vision disorder and the type of glasses they need to wear for that, or the different specifications. They'll like post about this on LinkedIn now, or they'll share about the time they were hospitalized for their mental illness. Like, what it does is it creates what I call, actually Laverne Cox coined this, more possibility models of what disability looks like. So that when you feel comfortable, or maybe you may never feel comfortable saying, hey, my kids have disabilities, they have all of these different possibility models that they can look toward. But the number one thing that happens for people with non-apparent disabilities is just being believed. I think, again, we have so ingrained in our mind of what disability looks like, right? So I didn't share this in my intro, but I got diagnosed with PTSD in 2019, which is 22 years after the car accident. And now I can look back and say, hey, if a 9-year-old went through something like that, I would maybe have them talk to somebody. But I didn't, right? And no shit, I think even to what Masasha was sharing about your conversation with your mom after your spinal fusion, and it's, hey, like something hard happened and I'm going to need support. I don't know like what way that's going to come in. Maybe it's the IEP, maybe it's a mental health professional, but like for 22 years to go by and me thinking that, because what would end up happening was I would get triggered and I would be transported to something that felt so real that wasn't real to other people. Now I'm way more aware and know how to navigate out of that. But it kind of took getting to that place for me to be able to know what I need and vocalize that. And before then, I was like lashing out at people and stuff.
One of the questions that I wanted to add on to this conversation was, part of what you said was to ask for support. And is there something about American culture that glorifies the need to suffer? Like they're not tough enough to make it through. Why should you have to ask for support? Like, is there some pressure that we're not discussing that we can bring to light to make it okay for people to ask for support and ask for their needs to be met?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that came to my mind was white supremacy. but I think there are a couple layers to this. So as I mentioned, I'm the daughter of Asian immigrants. In my family's East Asian culture, And as I was doing research for the book, mental illness is not viewed as a disability, which also means you have a very large group of Asian people who may need mental health support who aren't getting it because intergenerationally that message has been sent. I think one thing I learned from the pandemic that I'm hoping we don't forget, but we're starting to see some inklings of it, is that everyone was going through something at that point in time. If you lived by yourself, it was hard. If you had kids, it was hard. If you had a pet, it was hard. You've had it's like people are doing Zoom calls from their bathroom, their dog barking. Anyway, it's just everything was happening for everyone at that point in time. That I actually feel like during that period of time, we were more vocal about the things that we needed. We're like, hey, I got to go take my dog on a walk. I'm going to be off camera. Like, hey, my kids are in school in the other room, so you might hear them, I come back to this, like, how individual I feel like we are here in the US versus in other places that might be more collective or might be more connected to their broader extended families. And that's why I think we're seeing so much popularity around like vulnerability as a strength, right? Like, this is you being courageous. Why can't we build a culture built on vulnerability?
I think that's really important. I do agree that there seems to be a disproportionate focus on individual strength. And I also agree that it's tied back to white supremacy. So I will just co-sign all of that.
It's almost like, and I even tie in like how vulnerability was not viewed as like masculine, and that's where that immediate response came in, which is like, let's look at this system that is upholding all of these things, that it is weak to ask for help. Right.
Yeah. And I think Misasha and I were talking before we recorded, like, this work that you do is so linked to the work of uprooting systemic racism. Like, all of these systems of oppression are linked, and they have their nuance and their history and the language, but the mindset it takes to change them are all related.
Can I share one learning I had, which is the way that discrimination shows up for disabled people? Because it will be hard, or I hope it's hard, to find someone who says, I hate disabled people. The way it's thinly veiled is, I'll help you, but I won't hire you. I see you as someone less human than me, someone to be pitied. So I will take care of you. I will help you, but I do not see you as a peer. And I think that, I don't know, when I heard that as I was doing my research for this and having conversations with people, I was like, oh, it looks kind of like the same thing. Like, oh, like, let me help you with that. Like, oh, I feel great about myself, but oh, I can't. I was actually on a conversation recently where we were talking about kind of like some of the imagery that was used in a research report. And one of the corporate partners who was on the call was saying, oh, realistically, we won't have this type of person who has this disability in our workplace. And I spoke up and I said, I'm really into these possibility models. I said, well, part of the way we combat that is making sure that maybe someone who does have that type of disability can see themselves in that workplace. And they said, well, that's just not realistic. And I said in my mind, or maybe on Threads, I'm like, this is why we're still in the place that we're in. Because if you really, and Masasha, you said like people want the list of 12 things. And the thing is, I can give you a list of 12 things, but if you really do not fundamentally believe that we can be your equitable peers, then you will do all those 12 things, but you won't believe them, and it won't create that lasting change.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't make people care, is what we've realized in this work. And that's the sad truth, but you sure can remind people that we are all human, that there's 8 billion of us. We all have different stories. But one other layer to add on to that is, through positive psychology in that lens, one of the most fundamental needs humans have is to matter, to feel like they belong and they have value to contribute. And so what are people who don't choose to believe in the value of other human beings, of different abilities, of different disability status? Like, then you're adding, by making people feel like they don't matter, a layer of emotional baggage that they then have to continue to dig themselves out of. And what you said in one of your later chapters about the cost of being disabled, like, you're adding again more cost for disabled people to just get up to live on par, then it doesn't help our society's well-being either, right? And so we're all linked together, and we have to remember that we need to bring our humanity. But I see what you're saying about the lip service people are paying.
I mean, I do understand back to your question around like, how did we get to a place where like asking someone for support has become so difficult? And I did try to incorporate in some parts of this book the like, what's in it for me? So even in that chapter that's called Why You Should Care About Disabled People or Why This Matters, part of why this matters is if we live the full extent of our beautiful, colorful lives, we will become disabled. And this is not to fear people into caring. What this is, hey, if we prioritize accessibility now, if we start using inclusive language now, when we get welcomed, hopefully welcomed into the disability community, it won't have to be so hard. Even I think about like the admin burden for someone trying to get accommodations or even that IEP. And so I've included some stats in there of like, hey, and some research reports of it, like, hey, if you prioritize disability inclusion, it actually positively impacts your bottom line. That's for if you have any corporate type listeners. Hey, if you have disabled people within your organization or part of your design process, you can actually open up your product to millions of people who may not have thought that that product was available for you. I have a story in the book around getting to do some work around designing a VR headset. And the first time I wasn't able to put the VR headset on because it had some some soft Velcro straps that needed two hands. And after being there and being part of that process, the like lead or someone on the product team said, hey, for every headset we create from now on, we're going to have a one-hand test for it. And then I'm like, I think about the number of people who not only have permanent upper extremity disabilities like me, and there's actually research around this, the market for people who have upper extremity disabilities at any one point in time is 22 million or 21 million or over 20 million. I'm like, if I get the one or the two off, it's over 20 million. And so now you have opened up this product because before maybe you never thought, oh, someone who can't use one of their arms isn't going to use this, right? The assumptions that we make in terms of how we design things. And now maybe you have a bunch more people buying this VR product.
So you actually started answering my next question through this question, which is great because I just want to build on what you were saying, because not going back to the checklist idea, but going back to the concept of, let's say people do care, right? They care, they've read your book, and they want to do something differently, and they want to think inclusively. What can they do, basically? And what can they do tomorrow? Because there's going to be a ton of people who are like, there's so many things out there, I have no idea what I should do now.
What I feel most excited about is supporting disabled people's livelihoods. I mean, Sarah, you mentioned like the cost of being disabled. It's not only are we currently making less, and there's this phrase like last hired, first fired, like in times of potential economic uncertainty, we're the last hired, first fired. So we're making less, but we have more, it costs some of us more to live. So whatever you can do, and I know this will be broad, but it'll have a lot of sub bullets underneath, whatever you can do to help improve a disabled person's livelihood. So maybe you need a social media manager. Can you hire a disabled social media manager? There is some artwork featured at the end of the book, which is the Anti-Ableist Manifesto art, which I hired a disabled designer for. As I was editing my book, I hired a disabled editor, right? It's look at what's going on, and not announced yet, but may be announced in the next couple of days. But we're hosting our first LA book event at a disability-owned bookstore in LA, right? And maybe this is because I'm in the community, but I just think about what are all the different ways, like there's, even with this book, there's a whole ecosystem, right, that is supported by this book. People's livelihoods at my publisher, like the bookstores we're going into. How can we be intentional about the places that we're supporting? And can you search like disability-owned bookstore or disability-owned or disability social media person? Those all help support someone's livelihood. What can make the most direct impact, and I don't know if this is relevant for your audience, but there is a chapter in the book, probably my favorite, actually all of the chapters are my favorite. It's called Hire Disabled People, because when you hire us, you change our lives. Because Sarah, you mentioned, right, we all as humans want to figure out ways that we can contribute and be valued and matter. And when we don't have access to work or ways that are supporting our livelihood so that we can survive and hopefully thrive in this capitalistic system that we're currently in, then we continue to be disempowered. So if you are in a position to hire or change hiring practices within your company, like do an audit of your job descriptions and see the ways that you may or may not be unintentionally excluding disabled people. So one example I can share from my own personal experience, actually, I didn't see this on a job description, but it is on some. But sometimes it'll say, must be able to lift 25 pounds. But if I'm taking those two questions of like, what am I really trying to say? Is what I really am trying to say is must be able to transport 25 pounds? Because actually I can lift 25 pounds, but like if I couldn't lift 25 pounds, I could put it into a wagon. I used to have to transport a lot of pitch books when I was working in banking. I put them into a carry-on luggage with wheels and I wheeled that around. And so like even in that example of like, I may have counted myself out from that requirement to lift 25 pounds, or even ones that say must have a driver's license. When you say must have a driver's license, do you really mean must be able to transport between client meetings? Because now there are different ways that you can do that too, right? And I didn't include these in the book, which maybe I should have, but I've been thinking a lot more about the things that we include in these job descriptions that may count people out. But yeah, the overarching thing is support a disabled person's livelihood. And then underneath that is if you're a solopreneur or a small business owner, and can you bring on a contractor or support disability-owned companies in different parts of your supply chain? And then if you work at a bigger company, are there ways that you can really help be more supportive of hiring disabled people, supporting their livelihoods, but also changing their lives and serving as possibility models for all of those kids who thought that being disabled meant that they had no positive life outcomes.
I love that. Thank you very, very much for sharing that. I know you also mentioned in your book, diversify your feed. So I've already looked at our Dear White Women, like the people we follow, and added some of the recommendations. But people, sometimes people are comfortable talking about their disability. Sometimes people aren't. You may feel like if you're listening, like not know anybody who's disabled. There are people out there you can learn from who've chosen to do the work and share, and then maybe do the work to undo your own biases before you start asking the people in your lives about how they're doing. Just make sure you're showing up as the best version of yourself and learn from those who are already doing the work out there. What haven't we asked you that you want to share with our listeners?
Ooh, I don't know. I actually thought I really appreciated that you read the book and asked such thoughtful questions that I think take us from level 0.0 to 1.0, in this conversation. What haven't you asked me? I guess one thing I'll say is that I've been disabled for 27 years, and I have been active as a disability advocate for 15 years. And one of the reasons why I bring that up is because I have seen change. 15 years ago, I would mention disability pride, and I would get strange looks from people who were baffled how anyone could be proud to be disabled. And now in 2024, I live in California, and Governor Newsom proclaimed July as Disability Pride Month for all of California. And there are disability celebrations happening at the White House, like at that level. And I think just knowing that it's the long game, and that even just trying, I don't know, it's hard because I don't want to like pat people on the back, but I do think that I think we are a community that has been neglected and not even thought about for so long, that for me to even get a book deal 5 years ago, I could have counted on one hand the number of disabled friends I had who people thought our stories and the things we were talking about were worth being on a bookshelf. And now I'm just so excited that so many of us are getting represented in print form, but also I think to your point on the diversify your feed, are now getting opportunities through social media as well. But yeah, that was just a little tangent. I'll end with one thing, which is I saw one of my friends post something and she said, if you use any of the access features on your smartphone, like maybe you use speech to text to draft up a text message to a friend, or, some of those hands-free tools when you're driving, or maybe when you put your phone on silent, it vibrates, or when your phone rings, your flashlight goes off. Those are all accessibility features. And one of the things she said that I'm really appreciating is that if you're using our tools, please care about our community as well. It makes me think about other communities, like the way we've co-opted and not provided attribution for things in the Black community, right? Just give credit where credit is due. And if you are enjoying our things and our access features, like please show up for us as well too.
Love that. All right. Where can people find out more about you and the Anti-Ableist Manifesto?
Yes, you can find out about me and the book at my website, tiffanyyu.com. And while you're on there, you'll see all the places that you can get the book from your favorite retailer. And then you'll also see all my social media links there as well.
Love it. Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.